Hello and welcome to the Indeed Knowledge series on evidence-based evaluation, evidence-based policymaking, and evidence-based practice in the fields of preventing and countering violent extremism and de-radicalization. We're very excited to have with us today for our latest video interview and podcast, Dr. Lena Malkki. Dr. Lena Malkki is the director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Helsinki. She is a historian and political scientist specialized in the study of terrorism and violent extremism in Europe. She has extensive experience in the PCVE field, and particularly in cooperation with policymakers and practitioners. Her fields of interest include terrorism and violent extremism in post-war Europe, development of counterterrorism policies, and political and societal resilience to terrorism. She's also one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook on Radicalization and Countering Radicalization from 2023, which takes stock of the current state of research in the field. Dr. Malkki is one of the leading researchers also in the Indeed project and has played a central role in the development of the Indeed evidence-based model and the online evidence-based tool, which can be used by policymakers, practitioners, and evaluators to help design, develop, and implement evidence-based evaluation in the field. Dr. Malkki, welcome. It is a pleasure for us to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, in our episode today, we're really focusing in on the topic of cooperation between policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. So I'd like to start right off the bat by asking you, why is it important in the PCVE and de-radicalization field to develop cooperation between researchers and policymakers and practitioners?
I think there are many reasons for that. And why I think it's especially important now is that there's quite a significant drive in making PCVE field more evidence-based and to professionalize it in a way the field, which has started in a quite a spontaneous way to respond to urgent policy needs. And at this moment, there is an attempt to make it more professional and also to see what has actually worked and what hasn't. And to work in an evidence-based way here, I think academic research and collaboration with academic research has a lot to give in terms of building the evidence base, making the existing evidence more available, and bringing in the professional expertise that is needed for implementing evidence-based approach. And I think that would be the main reason why I think it's particularly important in the time that we all face of the policy field at this moment.
And where would you say we are now in terms of such cooperation in the PCV and de-radicalization field?
It's a little bit contradictory in a way that it's a field where collaboration between policymakers, practitioners, and researchers has a long history, actually. The current radicalization studies has its roots in terrorism studies that has been very policy-facing field traditionally. So there is this long tradition, but it has not always been very productive in a way that it has not been always very well thought out. And what so that the kind of history doesn't necessarily give the best possible ground for that. And in terms of preventing and countering violent extremism during the last 20 years, there has been quite significant collaboration with researchers, policymakers, and practitioners in Europe, especially in Radicalization Awareness Network, also in several Horizon projects. But I think that it still remains quite uneven. There are great examples of great collaboration, but also a lot of unused opportunities. There are some countries where the collaboration seems to be much more sort of convenient and easier and more kind of done now, whilst in other countries it is still somewhat conflicted and new ideas. So I think there's a lot to do also, and a lot of unused opportunities here, even if there are also really great examples of how to do that already.
So if we could delve a bit further into that, you yourself have extensive experience in working with policymakers and practitioners and bringing policymakers, practitioners, and researchers together. And as you've just said, there are different experiences. There are some excellent examples where it's worked well. There are challenges that are often experienced. I'd like to ask you, if you were to develop an evidence-based approach to improving cooperation between policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, building on all of the experience also within the Indeed project, what would be some of your recommendations and insights into how to go about doing that?
Well, the interesting thing is that there isn't a lot of evidence based in a scientific way here. There aren't really many studies on how effective collaboration between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners look like. That's quite a curious sort of blind spot in a way, even though we talk about this a lot. But if I sort of would work on my own experience and what I have seen that has worked is I think that the starting point is to have proper conversation first, and understanding that academic researchers and policymakers and practitioners have quite different priorities, timelines, different ethical and normative commitments, and that needs to be recognized and appreciated. They are also experts on their own in their own fields, and they all have different responsibilities. And I think all collaboration should build on that. So personally, what I have always I've had good experiences with the Finnish policymakers and practitioners, and I think the key there has been that the policymakers and practitioners have understood what the expertise of academic researchers are, and have not tried to sort of intervene in that field, and the researchers on their part have then understood that the policymakers and practitioners are not only working based on scientific evidence, they have also other things they have to consider, and they should in democratic society. And academic research cannot really kind of tell what the priorities should be, because it's always also a normative and political question. And I think that needs to be respected, and that the academic researchers may be experts in producing knowledge, but policymakers and practitioners are really experts on designing and implementing policies and practices, and navigating the complex territory of taking all relevant aspects into account while doing that.
There are quite a few aspects of what you just said that I'd love to follow up on further with you. And the first is just this part where you mentioned that that's a bit of a blind spot, which I think is quite interesting. As you said, we do speak a lot about the importance of strengthening that cooperation and creating processes, bringing together practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and working to strengthen the evidence base for policy and practice. It's interesting to hear that there isn't actually that much evaluation or bringing together of evidence into how to go about doing that, and looking at what might be some of the factors that can contribute to having it work well, as well as what are some of the challenges that I imagine might actually be sometimes fairly consistent and experienced across different contexts as well.
Yes, that's interesting, and I think a good benchmark for what could be is what we have in the field in terms of multi-agency collaboration, where policymakers and practitioners from different sectors collaborate together in initiatives to prevent and counter violent extremism, or in policy making. And I think a lot more attention has been paid to sort of building bridges between different sectors in the government, and also to the civil society to work with the NGOs. And there are several models already sort of building from practice about how that multi-agency collaboration could look like, and also models for evaluating multi-agency collaboration. But those multi-agency collaboration models do not usually include researchers, and they are not thinking about involving researchers. So it might be worth thinking about the role of researchers in those multi-agency collaborations themselves also, but also thinking whether we could have similar kinds of models for researcher, policymaker, practitioner collaboration, and also some models for how to evaluate such collaboration. Because there is a lot of experience and there are great examples of how to do that already, but we don't really know them like we know, for example, Århus model for preventing and countering violent extremism and so forth, that we already sort of know for multi-agency collaboration.
And I think a lot of the work and the research that has been done on multi-agency collaboration is often focusing very much on that actual collaboration and the mechanisms and experiences of collaboration between the agencies. We did a review of the research in the state of the field in 2019, so some years back already. But as I recall from that, there were two areas that are quite relevant to what we're speaking to, which were not addressed in most of the literature. One was about knowledge harvesting and management. So there was looking at knowledge exchange, but not as much then how you harvest and you manage that knowledge to be able to inform future practice. And the other was the link of the experiences of practitioners to actually input and inform into policy. So if we're looking at this nexus and connection between practitioners, policymakers, and researchers to strengthen the base of evidence-based policymaking and practice, then that's something which would be quite interesting to look into further. Now, in the Indeed project, the focus has really been very much on evaluation and looking at what's the state of the field of evaluation within the PCVE and de-radicalization field, engaging with smart hubs and practitioners all across Europe to learn from their experience and really diving into this concept and practice of evidence-based evaluation. So when we're speaking about strengthening cooperation between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, how about evaluations? How would this cooperation be helpful for advancing evidence-based evaluations in the PVE, CVE, and de-radicalization field? And how could the evaluations themselves be a tool or an instrument in strengthening that cooperation?
I think evaluations would be a really great place to, I can't say start because it's that kind of collaboration is ongoing, but really an area where we could do much more and where that work could be advanced at the moment. And the reason why I'm saying this is that I mentioned earlier that it should be acknowledged that academic researchers, policymakers, and practitioners have different timelines and responsibilities and normative commitments. And I think evaluations would be an area where they would maybe align most effortlessly. Because evaluations usually take more time and it's not like the same thing as with some kind of really urgent ongoing developments that the policymakers and practitioners would need knowledge right now, and academic research takes time, but there's time to wait for the results of evaluation. Evaluation is also basically evaluation methods and designs are based on academic research. So it would be something that is really within the expertise of academic researchers. Academic researchers would be, it would be helpful that they are not directly involved in policy making and practice, because they would have the necessary distance to act as external evaluators. So that would be also an asset. And it might be easier to find academic researchers who know the field than actually evaluators from think tanks or consultancies who do a lot of good work on evaluation but do not necessarily know this field. So there would be a lot of things that would speak for this kind of collaboration, definitely. And for academic researchers also, if the policymakers and practitioners are open for that, then academic researchers could also publish some results from the evaluation or use some parts of the evaluation to do also scientific publications, which is sort of one thing that is expected from academic researchers at the universities, which would facilitate also the collaboration and make the evaluation also look more professional, and since it has then also been peer reviewed by scientific community.
And that's an interesting area in and of itself, which we've looked at a good bit within the Indeed project, the utilization and how you bring forward the results from evaluations, bringing them out both in evaluation publications and reports, the value of also having it come out in scientific and peer-reviewed journals. And then it could be very interesting to see in deeper conversation with policymakers and practitioners, what are the ways they need that information to be brought out that can actually feed into the policymaking cycle and what policymakers need, and for hands-on use by practitioners. And I think you touched upon that earlier when you said all three actors need to understand the different cultures, the different needs of each other to be able to support that cooperation well. I find it very interesting in the Indeed evidence-based evaluation model. It really brings forward these three components of looking at what is the best available existing evidence and knowledge in the field and tested and validated, the insights, experiences, and decision-making of practitioners and all of that expertise that practitioners bring to the field, and also engaging with the stakeholder culture, context, perspectives, and needs, and really understanding that involvement of the communities and those that are affected by this. And you mentioned a word which we do hear in certain circles of evaluation that I think is quite interesting, democracy, earlier. And you spoke about this in a democratic society, the need to understand the roles of policymakers and others. How would you see evidence-based evaluation in this context as a democratic instrument or a democratic practice? The reason I ask is there's been a lot of feedback over the years that sometimes policy is being made without necessarily drawing on the actual experience of practitioners and those who are working on the ground. So in some countries, we don't necessarily have a strong connection between the practitioners that are doing the work and have that hands-on knowledge with the policy development processes and the deciding what will be the strategies and the laws. And in the same way, very often large parts of the population or communities and stakeholders affected, their views and their experiences and perspectives may not always be taken fully into consideration. In other areas of work, not necessarily in PCVE and de-radicalization, but in social work, in criminal crime prevention and other fields, they've also begun to look at evidence-based evaluation as part of the democratic process and as an instrument which can help to strengthen basically also holding policy accountable. And I wonder what your thoughts and perspectives on that would be.
I think there are multiple aspects there. I think one is what you already spoke about, that evidence-based evaluation calls for taking or involving stakeholders and taking also those who are running the initiative seriously, considering their needs, and calling for evaluations to be oriented towards learning, so that those who are implementing the initiatives could improve what they're doing. And the opposite of this would be to use evaluations to control, and sort of as a top-down instrument. So that would not be recommended, and it would make the evaluation, or it makes the evaluation more productive and useful and easier to utilize. And I guess you could also say more democratic, because it also considers the bottom-up approach by just being an evidence-based evaluation. It has the transparency and accountability argument, definitely, how public funding is used, to see how it works, and not as a control mechanism only, but as providing an opportunity for those who are using the money or putting it into use to do it as efficiently as possible by giving them an opportunity to learn. That is definitely a good thing. And having academic researchers as external evaluators, I think, would have an added benefit here, because really the commitment of academic researchers are for truth, however you understand it, but also for societal good. And the societal good is not the same thing as state interests. And many of the PCVE initiatives are funded by the state or by municipalities and so forth. So having the external evaluators looking at these initiatives would not only provide opportunities for learning, but it could also work as a critical eye on whether the programs are serving the common good of the society, more broadly speaking, which I think would be an important thing for, especially as we are considering or talking about the policy field here that is very politicized and very sensitive in many ways, and a complex one as well.
There's a part of what you've been speaking to that I think we perhaps have not actually had the opportunity yet to dive into too much in the discussions and work within the Indeed project in terms of what are the values and principles that guide work in this field. So you spoke about some of the values and principles that guide researchers. Now, the American Evaluation Society, the European Evaluation Society, they actually do have clear principles that they say should guide the work of evaluators. Do you think that that would be something that could be useful to develop or perhaps to look at and borrow from for evaluators working within the PVE, CVE, and de-radicalization fields to look at what should be some of those principles that could inform and guide good practice in the field?
Yes, that would be useful, and it's sort of inbuilt in the evidence-based evaluation model we have with and the way we have formulated, but it's maybe a little bit more implicit. And for the Indeed model, we also have the accompanying ethics checklist that also communicates some of the values of what kind of things should be considered. But that would be useful, and it would be useful more broadly also to have some kind of ethical code for the collaboration between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, not only in terms of evaluation, but also more generally, because it's not always easy for academic researchers to collaborate with the policymakers and practitioners. There are genuine ethical concerns also sometimes that are also valid, not not like like, for example, how the state will use the research results and researchers' input in legitimizing their policies and decisions. It's there is no inherent problem, but it's maybe a problem of trust and how exactly that is being done and what kind of ethical principles should guide the use of academic knowledge and also sharing information by policymakers and practitioners with academic researchers. I think they are all already like research ethics and similar kinds of principles that exist in the government would provide a good starting point, but it would be useful to have a more tailored document that could be referred to when going about this kind of collaboration.
This was actually a conversation which also came up in one of our earlier episodes in the Indeed Knowledge series, focusing on evaluation and policymaking, looking at some of the ethical considerations, the political considerations, and also some of the considerations that come up around the sharing of information, particularly when you're working with law enforcement or intelligence agencies, and having some guidelines that could provide good practice ways of handling these issues could actually help to support some of that confidence and trust and just knowing what some good practices are in the field. Now, for those watching the video interview or joining us in the podcast version of this episode, Dr. Malkki mentioned the ethics checklist, which has been developed in the Indeed project. If you're interested in learning more about that, you'll find it actually built into the Indeed evidence-based evaluation tool that is available on the Indeed website. You'll find a link to it in the notes for this session and in the materials on the Indeed website itself. So if you want, we do encourage you to go into those materials and to see how they can be useful for you in your own work and practice as well. Lena, I'd like to ask you, you touched upon this just a bit now and also earlier. Now, your own background is as a researcher, but as we've said, you've had extensive experience working with policymakers and practitioners. Coming at it from the point of view of a researcher, what would you recommend for a practitioner or a policymaker interested in involving an academic researcher in evaluating a PVE, CVE de-radicalization initiative? What could be some of the experience or recommendations you could share with them?
I would encourage practitioners and policymakers to contact academic researchers early on, already well before the evaluation is due, just to explore possibilities for collaboration and get to know researchers and find the right person. I know it's not always easy to find researchers, but if you kind of look around at the universities that are close to you, maybe when you find somebody who is working in this field, you can just contact that person and ask for recommendations. Academic researchers like to help others to find the correct researchers and know each other rather well. So just take contact. And the reason why I would prefer the policymakers and practitioners to reach early is that then the academic researcher would be able to give some recommendations on how to what kind of data to collect during the implementation of the initiative, maybe comment on the documentation of the initiative, whether the objectives have been clearly enough expressed, whether there is enough documentation on how the initiative is supposed to work. All these kinds of things that will have an influence on what kind of evaluation can be done later. There would also be time to build trust, time to think about ways to overcome the possible difficulties of data sharing. And importantly, there would be time to apply for funding for evaluation because, well, academic researchers can do some research based on their existing work contract, but often the evaluation takes more time than the sort of regular working hours and contracts allow. But there are opportunities for funding that could be explored, especially with academic researchers on board. So that it would be helpful to have some time for that. And also reserve time and initiate frank and honest discussions about the terms and conditions and expectations. That is, I said it already before, but I think that has been my experience very much, that successful collaboration has always involved good open discussion at the beginning about the reservations there may be, and the limits of collaboration and what issues are important for both parties. And then it's easier to cooperate when you sort of know where each other is coming from and you have negotiated the common ground in a way. So that would definitely be something I would recommend.
And this can be one of the strengths also of having standing instruments and platforms such as multi-agency collaboration and cooperation platforms, so that you're having policymakers, practitioners, and researchers working together on a standing basis and being able to build that mutual understanding of each other's experiences, contexts, and needs over time, build that working relationship and trust. And of course, in the Indeed model, there is that very clear emphasis and recommendation to policymakers, practitioners, and agencies, and everyone working in the field to really look at building evaluation in from the preparation and design phases of initiatives, be that the development of policy or the work of law enforcement agencies, civil society organizations, local governments, or any of those that are involved in working to address violent extremism and radicalization. Part of the evidence base that has been gathered in the field is how important it is to actually plan for and build in evaluation right from the design and preparation phase of your initiatives. Now, that can be very helpful both for practitioner agencies and work, but also something that can be looked at. And there's some good examples of this when it comes to evaluation of policy, where a number of countries, including, for example, the Flemish Parliament, have been working now forward, and other countries as well, to build evaluation components in right from the beginning when developing their national strategies and national action plans and responses for how to deal with violent extremism and radicalization.
And
You
that cannot be that cannot be
mentioned
emphasized enough. And also I might add that the involving academic research in the beginning is a good idea also, because the academic researcher might be able to help in understanding how to take evaluation into account in that early stage, and it would make everybody's life easier in the long run.
and
But
just
it's
creating that space for conversation and working together on it as well, because we've seen one of the challenges, not only in the PCV and de-radicalization field, but in the broad global experience of evaluation, has sometimes been that the agencies and organizations that are requesting evaluations, or even at times that have it sort of imposed upon them as a requirement from the government or from donors, they may not have that much background on evaluation. And sometimes things are simply put in the hands of the evaluator to come up with the design of the evaluation plan. But the challenge there is that sometimes the evaluator may not be privy to the insights and experience, the hands-on, on-the-ground knowledge of the practitioners. So one of the recommendations we would bring forward is, in the same way that Lena, you're bringing forward the strong importance of involving the evaluator right from the beginning, that can help agencies and government and policy decision makers to get that research insight and expertise from the evaluators, but also by having that conversation from the beginning, policymakers and practitioners can bring forward their experiences, their needs, and it's in that conversation together that you can really come up with a working model for evidence-based evaluation that can fit the needs and requirements of all involved.
Absolutely. And for academic researchers, this should also be stressed. The collaboration with policymakers and practitioners, when it's sort of based on well negotiated understanding and trust, is really helpful, because it also provides that kind of understanding of the realities of doing the work in this field that cannot be achieved in any other way. So I think if I hadn't been collaborating so much with policymakers and practitioners, I would have a very insufficient understanding of this policy field for sure. And it also brings access to data that academic researchers do not necessarily have access to, even with all the legal and other constraints that are there for sharing data. It still also brings whole new opportunities for purely academic research, if you put it that way, in the long run.
It can also help make us better researchers and lead
Absolutely.
better research as well.
Absolutely.
You spoke on a topic that is something that everyone who's worked in evaluation extensively or had experience with evaluations knows is so incredibly important. The expertise and experience of the evaluator themselves. And you were looking both at, you can have either think tanks or consultancies that might be experts in evaluation per se. So they the technical and the field knowledge of evaluation, but also the incredible importance of having the specific knowledge and understanding of the field it's being applied to. In this case, looking at PCVE and de-radicalization. And I think we've seen the importance of being able to bring both of these together. So to really be able to work and bring the best to an evaluation approach in the field, being able to draw upon hands-on deep knowledge and understanding of the issues involved in PCVE and de-radicalization, as well as that incredibly rich field of evaluation and evaluation approaches, methods, principles, lessons learned, and experiences, so that combining these two together can help to bring forward better quality evaluation practice in the field.
Absolutely. And one added bonus of having an academic researcher and instead of a consultancy without experience in this field is that data collection is not always very easy, and there are many peculiarities with this field that come from the sensitive nature of the topic, and that violent extremism is a rather rare phenomenon, and many other things. And these are things that academic researchers in this field are dealing with on a daily basis. So they already have strategies for overcoming some of these difficulties of applying research methods and processes for studying this particular field. Consultancies have their own strengths for sure, and not saying that at all, but to this day, I'm not aware that there would be a consultancy with extensive experience with this particular field that may be developing in the future. But in this regard of knowing the field, it seems that the academic researchers have a sort of headway for now here.
Well, one interesting example of that, actually, we've had on the episode in the past. It is the newly created M&E Center of Excellence at the International Center for Counterterrorism, which in some ways is exactly that, a bringing together of expertise in the field with expertise in evaluation. It'll also be very interesting to see how the new knowledge hubs evolve in Europe, and the potential there of building in both that cooperation between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners at both national and European levels. And what we hope to see also really taking a robust approach to building in evidence-based evaluation within the work of the knowledge hubs at again, both national and European levels. And then many of us across Europe, of course, are quite jealous of or appreciate the amazing opportunity at events like the Nordic Conference on Violent Extremism, bringing together researchers in the field. I think it's also looking at some of these institutional mechanisms and putting in place the spaces that bring together practitioners, policymakers, and researchers for knowledge sharing and exchange, so that you're not just having that benefit for individual evaluations, but then we're taking that experience and knowledge from the space of the individual evaluation, bringing it out to the field more broadly. Another very interesting example of that, of course, is the actual repository of both risk and resilience or protective factors that has been developed in the Indeed project, which is itself an attempt to really look at how we can better manage and harvest knowledge and evidence that has been gained in the field to support us both in further research, but also really in the design of initiatives and the design of strategies and policies for the field. Now, this is an exciting moment within the field of evidence-based evaluation and PCV. And as you said, when we began our conversation, there's more and more discussion of this. You've been at the center of so much of this throughout the last years, and we're seeing now new phases coming forward, especially with the creation of the new EU Knowledge Hub. What do you feel would help in broadening and deepening cooperation in the future? Are there any key insights or recommendations or things that you would like to see to help continue and take this cooperation forward?
The field has evolved initially, especially by sharing good practices. I would like to see more sharing of good practices about collaboration between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. I would also like to see more sharing of evaluations in this field, because for many understandable reasons, they are not always shared. But I believe that even within the constraints, it would be possible to share more so that we could learn from each other. And those platforms that you mentioned, like Nordic Conference on Violent Extremism and the EU Knowledge Hub, also the European Expert Network on Terrorism Issues, those platforms where policymakers, practitioners, and researchers meet would be perfect places to share that in the events. Not just talk about topics that are related to violent extremism itself, but also the forms of collaboration and ways of doing evaluations, because it's not always the evaluation results that is most useful to know in terms of developing evaluations, but generally just like how the evaluation was designed, what exactly was done, and what kind of learnings were drawn from the evaluation process itself. So not the results in terms of what was found out about the initiative that was evaluated, but what was learned about evaluation itself through doing the evaluation. And apart from sharing it in the events, it would be really great to see, for example, EU Knowledge Hub to also produce some compendia of good practices or promising practices on this front also in the future.
Then they've brought together also so many of the recommendations that have been coming forward from the Indeed project on these topics, just to highlight some of them. And we'd love to also hear your feedback as listeners and those that are watching this video interview together with Dr. Malkki in the comments section on the channel. Please do share if you have recommendations as well as your own experiences, and also links to good practices and resources in evaluation or results from evaluation. But one of those that you mentioned was the sharing of evaluations. And our colleague in the Indeed project, Professor Stefan Prost, has played a key role in development of the Indeed repositories. And in that work, also came up with the idea of creating a repository of evaluations that would include both a repository of evaluations that have been completed, and of course you can go through them, you can clean them so that you're removing, for example, names of specific agencies or individuals to ensure that you're upholding GDPR and protection of information and data as necessary. But you can still play a really useful role in making those evaluations available more widely to the field, and the proposal for having a repository of evaluations as well as a repository of evaluation practices, methods, and approaches that can help to improve the quality of evaluations in the field. Now, there is already a fantastic resource, the website betterevaluations.org, which goes through so many tools and materials. Then again, you also have the Indeed website itself with that evidence-based evaluation tool. But the idea here is to actually create a repository of approaches, methods, experiences in evaluation that is specific to the PCVE and de-radicalization field. Another instrument that Indeed has really brought forward has been the training, not only of evaluators, but really the training of practitioners, researchers, people working in the field more broadly, to have basically a raised awareness and understanding of what is evidence-based evaluation, what are approaches to evidence-based evaluation policy and practice, and why is it important for the field. So this itself, broadening that level of hands-on knowledge and understanding, can improve the ability of all of us working in the field to engage effectively with evaluations. And then another proposal also, which a number of Indeed episodes in the knowledge series have addressed, and it's a conversation coming up more and more in the field, the idea of creating a community of practice of evaluators, as well as a community of practice of evaluators, policymakers, and practitioners in this field. So we have experiences like the Nordic Conference. We're seeing that coming up more and more. We've all the great experience gathered over years through RAN. Now with the Knowledge Hub, perhaps the opportunity to also strengthen this at local and national levels, as well as across Europe, the collaboration between a community of practitioners working on evidence-based evaluation, policy, and practice in the field. Lena, you really are at the heart of so much of this. You've played such a key role within the Indeed project and the development of the evidence-based evaluation tool, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you also in our Indeed Knowledge series today. I would just like to say thank you for all of the work that you're doing and for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.